small elite of the very wealthy with the very powerful, who would just come to the conclusion that they should run the world.
As the world begins to resume some form of quote-unquote normality, many would argue that we are witnessing a continuation of the challenges to civil liberties, democracy, and human rights that were experienced throughout the world during the pandemic. In addition, this is to rising cost of living, inflation, and other economic challenges in the wake of COVID-19. It's also evident that the global centralised organisations such as the World Economic Forum are advancing their efforts to capitalise upon the crisis and drive forward the idea of a new social contract. Are these trends likely to represent a temporary overspill following the somewhat authoritarian responses to COVID-19 around the world, or do these represent a longer-term trajectory? To help us to understand these issues, I'm joined today by Jeffrey A. Tucker, founder and president of the Brownstone Institute, a non-profit organization that was founded in May 2021 with a vision of a society that places the highest value upon the voluntary interaction of individuals and groups, whilst minimizing the use of violence and force, including that which is exercised by public or private authorities. He's a distinguished fellow of Austrian Economics Centre in Vienna, a research fellow of the RMIT Blockchain Study Group, a columnist at Forbes, chief liberty officer and founder of liberty.me. Many of us have heard of the work of Brownstone during the course of the pandemic when we were seeking to understand the impact of the responses to COVID-19 upon our lives and our livelihoods. Your articles in the American Institute of Economic Research on the effect of lockdowns have been widely shared by many. And it's fantastic to see the work that has now been done within the Brownstone Institute, where you're offering a wealth of articles by distinguished experts and have even published some books in this brief time since inception. I'm curious to open up, Jeffrey, by really exploring the rationale for you beginning your work with Brownstone. What led you to take the step, really, of forming an organization like this? I'm really curious to understand your personal take on what's happened over the last couple of years and why you've taken such action.
In March 2020, I thought it was a brief mistake. It was just a kind of error that took place, that we pursued these wild policies. And I had assumed that they would go away in a couple of weeks. Actually, I'm surprised they lasted that long. I kind of thought that the lawsuits would pour in, that people would wake up to the demographics of the death. We'd start looking at the science and see that there was a wild overreaction and that a small cabal of intellectuals had somehow grabbed hold of the reins of the power all over the world and had done very bad things to us, in contrast to our entire history, since the Magna Carta, of trying to limit arbitrary government power. But that didn't happen. It just kept going on and on and on. And so by the next year, I began to realize that, there's something much more substantial going on here, and that we're actually threatened with opening up the end of the liberal era, broadly conceived in that sense. And we can talk about what that means. But it seemed to me there's a fundamental challenge at work to everything we believe about ourselves and our public lives and what kind of societies we want to live in. That this whole thing had mutated into some sort of ghastly machinery that we had never encountered before, really not in our lifetimes, or really in many generations, if that. So, it doesn't fit into any of the old categories of, fascism, socialism. This is a different kind of technocratic dictatorship, really. That's a fundamental challenge to everything we have been taught to believe all of our lives, and it's remarkable how quickly it happened. So I knew that we needed a dedicated institution that would examine this bigger problem, to deal with the research burdens of figuring out why it happened, and to bear some of the burden of trying to reconstruct what it is we're supposed to believe about ourselves, and to understand why it is that infectious disease, of all things, became the trigger for inaugurating a kind of a fundamentally different era of life. And the reason for Brownstone is that I didn't see anybody else doing this. You know, um, really from January of 2020, I felt very much alone in this whole thing. You know, I wrote an article on January 20th, 2020, saying that the worst thing you could do in the case of an epidemic is unleash, unchecked government power against people. The quarantine power is what we called it in those days. Now we call it lockdowns, but I warned that this is completely inconsistent with any kind of rational disease mitigation, and that it would unleash terrible things in the world. And I was called an alarmist. People, had me on podcasts, and they said something like this would never happen to us. I mean, the courts of law would prevent it. People would rise up in anger. The Congress would be angry about it and stop it. But a month and a half later, we began to see all this stuff unfold before our eyes, and to my great shock, there was no public opposition that I could see. And then it got worse. That was March 8th, was the first evidence of lockdowns in the United States, imposed lockdowns, right? And that came 1 week after the New York Times had urged, the disease planners to try a new experiment. They called it medieval, but I mean, even in the Middle Ages, they didn't lock down. People were not sick, so it didn't make any sense. But so things were moving very, very fast, and I began to write about this with all my energy, and I've written probably by this point, I mean, I don't know, over the last 2 years of that. Maybe not quite 1,000 articles, but quite a lot. Just to try to make sense of it. And what I couldn't believe, really, was just the extent to which all the people you thought would stand up against all this kind of stuff just went silent, which is still a little bit mystifying to me. I'm talking about people on the left who have been champions of civil rights and free speech and against segregation, and the people on the right who are for the Constitution and for limited government and American tradition, for that matter. Same thing happened in the UK, of course. And then you have, of course, my favorite gang, the libertarians, who, how should I say, underperformed. I mean, it was unbelievable. So everybody kind of flopped and didn't get better for a very long time. Anyway, that was the reason I started Brownstone, because I felt like we needed some dedicated work, with some of the serious, principled scientific and thinkers who care about liberal values and really understand in a sort of tactile way the practicality of liberty.
Yeah, so I'd like to unpack, you mentioned this kind of perceived end of a liberal era that has kind of been ushered in via this response to the virus. And I think, there were people who were just justifying this under public health grounds, and that, once the virus passes, life will go back to the old normal. But in fact, we've got this new normal that's emerged where, those traditional liberal values are still well and truly under question. Did you witness any warning sign of this coming prior to the pandemic? Were we already on a slippery slope? Was this an exacerbation of an existing trend, do you think?
I mean, the answer to that is yes, and it's easy to look back and see all the ways in which that was true. On the left, the censoriousness had already sort of ramped up, and I was very concerned, even 2 years before the pandemic lockdowns came, the ways in which basic postulates of global politics had come into question. I mean, I'll just give you an example. The idea of decoupling, the world technologically, so that the US and the UK and Europe would become completely separate from China. I mean, I don't know who came up with that idea. I mean, it seems maybe it was driven by Trump alone. I'm not sure. But that's inconsistent with, 70 years of post-war progress that we had made in the realm of trade. And also a bit of a millenarian sort of belief. I mean, it's really essentially inconceivable. But Trump's tariff war, was already had unleashed several things. One was, policies that were inconsistent with 70 years of progress, but then also a kind of autocratic decision making from the top. I mean, this is one of the things about the trade power in the U.S. is that Congress gave up its authority to control that a very long time ago, around just after World War II. So the president had the ability to do this, and Trump likes to be in charge. So this is something he could do, and but just somebody would put a list of companies with whom the U.S. had a trade deficit, in the order in which they appeared, and he would just go through the list and start imposing tariffs one after another. And this is just sort of not the way government takes place. So yeah, gradually over the course of a very long time, terrible things had happened to our public life, and going back in time, I mean, you could go all the way back really to 20 years to the response to 9/11, which was nowhere about, like, not at all about figuring out the ways in which we could reconstruct the world in a way that would be more liberal at all. It was never that. Maybe dial back some of the wars, maybe not be so provocative in foreign policy. But it was always about the answer to everything was more security provided by the central government. I mean, that was the answer to everything. So yeah, the decay in liberal values had begun long before. But I mean, part of me, and I try to avoid conspiracy theory, but part of me wonders if, I mean, if there were some sort of elite cabal, that had been holding, infectious disease in their back pocket for a very long time in order to kind of deal the final blow to the liberal project. They certainly deployed that in 2020. And why? That's the great question.
Yes, I think with these things, it's obviously complex, but history is a great teacher when it comes to crises, whether it's warfare, pandemics, economic crises. I think it would be very reasonable to state that those with power and ability and control will use the opportunity to advance their own aims, because society becomes more vulnerable, the checks and balances start to fall away. And well, we've certainly seen an erosion of, just certainly in the UK, checks and balances. Well, they fell off a long time ago, and they haven't really returned, to be quite frank, which is even more worrying. But there does seem to be a cultural swing towards this idea of safetyism, for your protection. I absolutely witnessed that following 9/11, and even more so now during COVID. What role do you see the likes of the WEF, the World Economic Forum? This topic has been reduced to conspiracy in the mainstream press,
Sure.
but the reality is this is a very influential group who very publicly have agreements with governments, intergovernment organizations like the United Nations. It should be relatively clear. We don't live in an era of kings and queens anymore in the age of empires. We now live in the age of commerce and corporatism. To what extent, the palaces of old are replaced by the glass towers in the cities. To what extent do you think these types of organizations have are playing a role now in the erosion of these liberal values?
Well, there's always going to be an organization, and it's hard to say that the organizations, cause the conspiracy or whatever. I mean, I think what you have here is an imbalance of power. All of these elites, these very, very high level elite circles where the very rich hang out with the very rich, and then they want to be around the very powerful and vice versa. And they've reconstituted their lives so they only have to be around each other and avoid any kind of democratic interchange with anybody else. And so this is what they've become, and this is the way they like it, and this is the way they want to preserve it. Unfortunately, it puts their thinking into a little bubble. It's hardly unusual in history that you would have a small elite of the very wealthy with the very powerful, who would just come to the conclusion that they should run the world. And so then that's the first premise. And the second one is, well, okay, now what should we do with it? And so at the WEF, you have every kind of cranky idea, imaginable, just spilling out all over the place. And you can go to their website and read all about it. It's actually deeply embarrassing. But liberalism, as traditionally understood, it's just not part of what they think. I mean, they really believe in a kind of a top-down management of society. And as I said initially, this is not socialism. It's not capitalism. It's not communism, and it's not really sort of interwar style fascism as such. It's really something different. It has something to do with wild aspirations. Allegedly based in science, mostly based in crank theory, and that let's live in a world without any pathogens. Let's get all of humanity on a subscription plan for our new fancy drug technology. Let's get rid of fossil fuels. Why is it that people are allowed to just buy pets and keep them in their homes? How come people keep eating all this beef when we can clearly, just make a good beef substitute with my little machine over here, and so on. So you get these, this sort of unfolding of these wild ideas in these elite circles and their cocktail parties, and there's no check on them, and then it's very easy for this group to have disdain for everybody else. And so you've got people out in the streets saying, "Give me liberty," and they're like, "I don't think you understand. Your liberty is not where we're going here. It's just not. This is not what we're doing around here. Your liberty is the problem. We're the solution." So this is the way they think. And I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years trying to understand who these people are and how it is they think. And Bill Gates is a good example of that. I mean, he's as good an example of that as anybody. But what's fascinating to me is that I think this is very sort of malicious, it's nefarious, it's dangerous, it's conspiratorial, it's wicked, disdainful, condescending, and deeply dangerous for the future of the world. But the fact is that what they have attempted has not worked. I mean, so this is what's fascinating to me. They deployed this machinery, and now we're surrounded by the carnage. I mean, 2 years of lost education that in particular affects the poor, minority populations, marginalized peoples, and the working classes, or the upper classes did fine. And these are not just small effects. We've got a mental health crisis among the young. We've got hundreds of thousands of businesses, small businesses that were destroyed in this country, while the big businesses got richer than ever. So, I mean, the missed cancer screenings, the missed, childhood vaccinations, the inflation, the supply chain breakages and good shortages. I mean, right now in this country, you can hardly get baby formula, if you can believe it. It's like unbelievable. So by any metric, they failed. Oh, and by the way, everybody got COVID anyway. You know,
Yes. Yes.
uh, so so really, December 21 was I think the great month of of the big flop. Because they had been battling COVID for a year and a half, and then finally the Zoom class, decided to come out of their little hovels, and instantly got infected, of course, and inevitably, and the cases, at least in the U.S., I think the same. I'm not sure about the UK case, but at least in the U.S., it was wild, right? The numbers in December of 21 uh, made everything, just ridiculous. Every previous proclamation of victory, every metric, every celebration of this policy because that policy caused this. Look, cases are down. Oh, the masks worked, whatever. Well, December 21, it just blew everything up, and they all look like complete idiots. So this is a major problem, I would say, for this crowd. I mean, if really you were given the chance of a lifetime to reconstruct the world order with one goal, to minimize COVID infections, or really eradicate the thing like a lot of people wanted to do, and it doesn't work, now you've got a problem. You've been discredited, and that's really essentially where we are right now. Public health authority, really all over the world, is living in disgrace. But you'll notice there's very little admission of this at all. It's just like hardly anybody's willing to admit error, or much less apologize for it. So we've got a huge tension right now in the world, which is why sometimes it feels like the anti-lockdown movement has got a populist flavor to it. But that's just because the lockdowns were imposed by the 0.1%, and everybody else was the victim, and now everybody else is super mad about it and extremely upset, and we're not getting any truth or honesty, and forget justice. That's nowhere near where we are. So this is going to be a very long battle. And my strong sense is right now, for lack of a better term, the ruling class really wants everybody to forget, about what happened to us. So now we're supposed to think about Ukraine. Now we're supposed to think about I don't know what, abortion or something. Just they keep testing out other big topics about which we're supposed to care more intensely than the fact that our lives were destroyed over the last 2 years. So this is going to be an ongoing battle.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've used the term common sense corner throughout the last couple of years when I've been analysing this. If you've got policies that cause more harm on aggregate by a significant margin, then there surely comes a point where in everyone's mind, it's a case of, well, everyone got COVID anyway. We have destroyed people's livelihoods. The economy's in a really bad place. We've got a healthcare crisis, all of the things you've mentioned. You would have thought there'd be this like gradual tipping point towards public outrage. But I just feel like the opposite has happened. It's almost as though people have just gone to this default mode, which is, well, if only we had this lockdown earlier for longer and we'd completely shut down and never opened up again, no one would have got it. This myopic thinking around a single pathogen as opposed to any other variable. If you think about any entrepreneur or business owner, if they only focused on, say, a single line of cost on their accounting records at the detriment of everything else, they'd be out of business very, very quickly, because they're no longer focused on marketing, revenue, growth, etc. They may have minimized a certain cost line, but everything else has fallen to pieces, customer service, everything else. But that's essentially what we've done for the last 2 years, is focused on a really myopic piece. And it took it hasn't mattered what the consequences have been. Even if it's 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 harm, it doesn't seem to matter. But you're absolutely right. That outrage just doesn't seem to be there. And there's this clinging on to this idea that what what went before us is what will continue. This talk about applying the same methodology to flu seasons, and testing for every fiber of flu that circulates in winter. And it's this idea that humans can overcome through science any possible threat to human life. Well, to me, that's, on one hand, it's noble that humans have that capability and ingenuity and innovation, but our lack of foresight to go beyond the point at hand and look at the second order consequences and the holistic impact of decisions is quite frankly worrying to me.
Yeah, and imposed by force, right? So it's not just that they've got the science, but they've got the experts and the power. Look, it's no different. It's really no different from what it was like in the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, because there was a belief on the part of Lenin and the Bolsheviks that they were the smartest people around. They had now all the power they needed, and they could get any resources they wanted. Now it was just a question of, let's implement it. And then the question was, implement what? Right? And so there was a bit of a loss of understanding there. And Lenin, at some point, I think it was the Second Party Congress of Soviet, I don't know, whatever, said, look, you can sum up communism in two principles. One is dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, that doesn't mean anything. The second principle is the electrification of Russia. Okay, well, that's a concrete goal here. Well, they attempted it, and it didn't work, and people didn't want their stupid electricity. They were perfectly happy with their lives the way it was. And by 1921, 22, there was mass starvation. So they dialed it back, dramatically, and then there was a new economic policy. So their plans failed pretty rapidly, but it took a very, very, very long time for the ideological conviction that they were right all along to sort of finally disappear. And this is what I'm seeing right now with the lockdowners, because what you get from Bill Gates is out promoting his new book right now. He's doing a kind of a book tour, and he's a little bit loose-lipped and a little bit nervous and a little bit goofy. So he's always misspeaking all the time. But if you wanted to summarize his outlook right now, he's like, our theory was perfect. Our aspirations were flawless. Never question our theory and never question our motivations. Now the implementation was lacking in some areas. It's true. So he tries to think that we kept schools probably closed too long, and if we had a better sense of the demographics of the impact of this disease, we might have more finely tuned the policies around that. But hey, we've learned, and we're going to do a better job next time, and there will be a next time. And there's no fundamental question of the overarching theory of lockdowns or disease eradication through human separation. That remains intact, and that has become like a religious doctrine to these people. So it's tremendously terrifying, and I think that's what we have to upend.
Yes, well, I don't think it's going to be limited to pandemics, infectious diseases. It's climate issues, it's agricultural issues, economic issues. We're the smart ones. We know best. We have the power. This, true technocratic approach.
Yeah, that's always the idea. It's the ultimate anti-liberal position. We have the power, we have the brains, and we have the resources. So therefore, there should be no limit to our vision. That's what they always say. That's what they believe. And the idea of liberalism is fundamentally contrary to that. It's really stems from the belief that no matter your power, your intelligence, your resources, you're going to be better off with generally better social outcomes by letting people manage their own lives. Okay, that's the idea of liberalism, and that's been true for 700 years. And that's what's come under fire. And it's very interesting to hear your perspective that you see this as, by and large, people are going along with this. So maybe that's true, but I think it really is very much class-based and education-based. Like Anthony Fauci spoke at the University of Michigan the other day, and they gave him an honorary doctorate. And I watched the video, and all the entire senior class at the University of Michigan, these people were imprisoned to their dorms, kept from attending classes, paying huge amounts of money for a degree they're going to soon find out is not that valuable. But they had 2 years of their lives ruined. And instead of booing this guy, they cheered. They were on their feet cheering the great Fauci. Why? What is that about? Now, I can tell you this. You go to any rural Texas community and ask what they think about Anthony Fauci, they're going to be spitting on the ground. It really is a class-based thing. So depending on how elite your education is and how much you're sort of clamoring for that next tier of social status, very much I think determines your degree of confidence in this sort of ruling class management of society. And so Fauci has become this kind of symbol of what the elites want, which is to be in charge, to tell other people what to do, to use maximum resources to enact, great shock and awe type history-changing experiments on society. So my read on, at least in American political culture, is that this is really very much class-based. Whether you love this idea and have confidence in it, or you hate it and you despise it, which is why it's really disturbing American politics, like profoundly disrupting American politics. It's no longer the malleability. What's the right word? The mobility between the political loyalties has increased dramatically.
Well, it's interesting to hear that take. I wonder as well your observations on the kind of generational piece, because we recorded somewhere. It's hard to keep track of how many episodes we've done because of the certain episodes have been censored on certain platforms. So actually keeping a running total of actually how many we've done, but somewhere between 400 and 500 episodes in the last 2 years, reached somewhere between 10 and 15 million people. But if we look at our demographics, I'm 38 years old. Our average audience age-wise was sort of 55 plus. And we pretty much, we didn't have no one under 35. But if you look at the distribution of our viewership, and maybe I've lost touch with the kids and I'm not cool anymore, but if I ever was, but this point, we've got this older demographic that's been the core listener base, if you will. And I've also entered now into other communities that are tackling other issues outside of the pandemic, but related to human agency. And it's this, I see the same patterns. It's the younger generation have seen, not completely. I'm not going to say there's no one, but I wonder if there's something here around liberal values and how younger generations perceive, human agency, freedom, open societies, their own personal agency to direct and influence their own lives and the lives around them. What's your take on the generational piece?
I think you're right. I mean, that fits entirely with my read on the situation. And that was true very early on in the pandemic. It became very obvious to me that you've got a kind of a 20-something demographic that was all in for lockdowns. The first time I noticed this was, I think it was early March. No, it was about, maybe it was first week of March. No, it was the second week of March. It's amazing to try to reconstruct all this timelines here, but there was a distillery that I used to go to. They make liquor, and it was a very nice place. And previously, when I would go there, they had a number of I guess you would say, like clerks or salespeople there, but one was a kind of a late 20s something, tatted and an earring here and there, but very well spoken, talking about the various notes, the grassy notes in this bourbon and the hint of violet in this gin and so on, and really sort of swishing around the place, like good job, good life. And then when there's an announcement that there's a pathogen on the loose, next thing you know, she just completely transformed it. And as I mentioned to you, I thought this was a temporary hysteria. I mean, I thought maybe it'd last 48 hours, but I drove up to the place, dressed as I usually do. I just so happened to be in a small, convertible race car, with a scarf flying in the air because it was a nice day. Drove up. Well, she was dressed with, obviously a mask, like completely over her face, blankets around her, puffy house shoes, and just covered from head to toe. She looked like, like a Taliban wife. And I walked up there and I said, "So what's going on around here?" She said, "Well, we've converted all of our distilleries to instead of making liquor for people's enjoyment, we're making now hand sanitizer for to protect people from the dreaded pathogen." And I said, "Oh, that's really great. Can I have a dozen bottles of that because I want to buy them as souvenirs to give them out because this is, it's got to be one of the most hilarious moments of life." And she said, "I will not sell you a dozen. I'll sell you one. And can I say I find it deeply offensive that you're out for a joyride in the middle of a pandemic?" Well, this is my first exposure to the social justice, to the Corona justice warrior, class, and I was startled, and I said, "You're serious, aren't you?" And she said, "Deadly serious." And so she threw me out. And so I drove home and I thought, well, can you imagine such a thing? But when her boss finds out that this employee was so rude to me, he's going to be undoubtedly very upset. Well, and I don't usually do this, and I wasn't trying to get her in trouble, but I wrote the owner and I said, "You've got to do something about your employees. They seem to have gone insane for this disease thing." and he never answered me, but I didn't realize it at the time. But that there was a kind of hysteria had swept a major swath of the northeast of the United States, especially the young and well-educated. And I couldn't understand it, and because it's almost like these people never paid any attention to ninth grade cell biology. They really did not understand that the way to boost your immune system is through a regular daily exposure to the mildest version of the pathogens as a way of protecting you from severe outcomes. And the biggest danger you could ever face is a naive immune system. That disease, pathogenic avoidance is a catastrophic way to go about life. I mean, that's how whole tribes and peoples have been wiped out in the past issue. But you've got now a whole generation, like I said, never experienced any of this stuff. I guess they've always been it's the medicated generation or something. They're just waiting for the shot, waiting for the pill, waiting for the doctor to care for them or something like that. And actually, in a Hegelian sense, it's not just ignorance that was driving us. I gradually learned that what you have is a search for meaning. Mm-hmm. A lot of this generation, I would put it like the under 35s. Too much education, too much credentials, the expectation of privilege and prosperity, forever. That they had been robbed of any kind of real challenge in life, and human beings need that. We want to be part of we want to be part of a bigger story, and for whatever reason we constructed sort of a bourgeois framework of endless peace and prosperity, and debt for several generations of people. So they never experienced any kind of challenge. So when the pathogen came along and CNN screaming this, the CDC saying that, and Fauci saying this, for a lot of these people, it was there was now a great chance for their lives to become meaningful, to enter into some sort of big drama, to make a big sacrifice, to be part of a wave of enthusiasm in the old sense of that, in the Belloc sense of that term, enthusiasm. And it gave them a sense of purpose and meaning that they previously lacked. So the coronavirus for a lot of these people became a kind of a substitute for a fill-in for what they're really looking for was some raison d'etre. What is the purpose of my life? What am I doing here? What can I do to achieve it? How can I really matter? How can I make my life meaningful? And the virus became, that sort of philosophical rallying point in absence of a kind of a robust religious faith or any other deeper sense of meaning, which they had been robbed of for their entire lives. So I think that's what it is. Older generation, had different life experiences, so they didn't have that kind of that great challenge, that great Hegelian questioning of the meaning of their lives. But for a whole generation, I think that's what it really amounted to.
I think some of that behavior that you've discussed, here's the interesting thing, I suppose, and perhaps there's a correlation here, but liberalism is often cited as like the cause of this type of problem, in the sense that, we've got these privileged, educated people. There's not enough jobs to go around. The market has created these situations. I personally think it's a flawed analysis of what's occurred, but I do wonder if there is some truth to it. What's your, when commentators are looking at the flaws of liberalism, what is there any critique that you think is valid, and if so, what's your take on the broader critique of liberalism?
Well, it is the single most powerful critique of liberalism ever made. In fact, it's so strong that I think sometimes all the rest is just a footnote. Carl Schmitt, I think, was the most powerful articulator of this view in his 1932 book called Politics, the question of the political, I think is the name of the book. And it's definitely, and you know who Carl Schmitt was, right? I mean, he eventually, of course, became a Nazi and was dragged before Nuremberg even, but they let him go because they said, well, he's just a stupid philosopher, who cares? Well, read his 1932 book, and it's a fascinating book because it says liberalism posits a life without politics, and his bête noire in this case is Benjamin Constant, and Constant's really great 1830 essay called "The Difference of the Liberty between the Liberty of the Ancients and the Moderns." We don't have to go into that, but the point is that Schmitt hated this guy. And he said, look, there's this guy Constant who imagines that bourgeois life is meaningful, where you just get along with people and you trade and you find value in others and everybody has equal dignity, and you go and you shop and you consume. And he says, to hell with that. That's just a boring and irrelevant life, and it's going to bore people to pieces. What we really need is politics. And politics, in other words, liberalism imagines a world without politics, according to Schmitt. And so what we really need, if we believe in politics, and we should, is that there always needs to be, if we're going to preserve politics as a way of life, there always needs to be a strong friend and enemy distinction. And that we need to know who the enemy is. They need to be identifiable. We have to have a conception of who the enemy is. And we need to know who our friends are. We need tests to find out who our friends are and who our enemies, who our friends are, and who to rally, to whom should we owe our loyalties, and whom should we hate. And he said, enemyness needs to be much more than just an abstraction. It needs to be real. We need to see evidence of the enemy being slain. And we need blood so that we can really enter into this great drama And he said, you might ask, well, who is the enemy? And he said, and Schmidt said, look, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. Let other people choose who that's going to be. The point is that it has to exist. There has to be an enemy. We have to have friends, and that's what gives life to politics. And liberalism can never work because of this absence of drama and meaning that only politics can give us. So I think this is a very dangerous but compelling critique, and I don't know if I have a very strong answer to it, except to say that within bourgeois society and structures of human liberty itself, we need to find ways that people can live a dramatic life. People need to face risk to have an opportunity for overcoming great barriers. To in the course of your normal life, to face the possibility of humiliation or loss of social status or bankruptcy or disease, these kinds of things, these challenges, you don't have to create those. Those exist as part of the structure of life itself. Unfortunately, what we've done is we wanted to preserve liberalism while draining it of all of its risk and creating, the aspiration to make extremely comfortable lives for everybody through the endless accumulation of debt, through this entitlement mentality, and so on. And unfortunately, it's boring. A safe liberalism is just too boring to people, and they began to look for ways to live more meaningful lives. And so I think as we think about a post-pandemic world, if we decide that we believe in human rights and equality and equal dignity again, we need to figure out ways to reinfuse the liberal experience with the natural dramas and risk of life itself, instead of always creating ever safer playgrounds and ever less financial risk and ever less opportunities for entrepreneurship and that sort of thing. We need to remove and could say nothing of the healthcare systems. Guaranteed everything. Is what we've done to liberalism. I would say we need to reinfuse life with its natural and normal sense of risk and danger, and permit people to enter into that world and not judge them for it, knowing for sure that through danger comes a sense of challenge and ultimate victory over all the odds. I'm sorry you've kind of unleashed in me this soliloquy, but you'll need to look at, I don't know what goes on in the UK, but in the US for the last, I would say 30 years, games at children's birthday parties are never about competition anymore. Pin the tail on the donkey, everybody wins. Musical chairs, forget it, because that means there's only enough chairs for the people who happen to grab one, and there's always one kid crying in the corner because he didn't get to sit down. All those games have been eliminated from childhood experience now, so everybody's a winner. And then the grade inflation, everybody gets an A. Or kids sports. Forget it. The idea that you're going to let the best batters, bat before the worst batters, or the best person at pitching pitch. No, everybody gets to be a pitcher. Everybody gets to be a batter. This is the way we've reconstructed our lives. Well, this is dull, and it gives rise to it makes Carl Schmitt's critique of liberalism actually very compelling.
Well, I liked your description of. I can't remember the exact words, but you said that the libertarians, in some way haven't shown up. But but I wonder again if it's extremes, because I spoke to someone on the show who is traditionally of a strong libertarian background, but it was the idea that libertarians will have free agency as long as it doesn't come to the harm of others. Now, when you're positioned with this idea that you've got this circulating pathogen and just by breathing you could kill someone, this is how this idea. Oh, but hang on a minute, my free agency now comes with risk, and the reality is freedom does come with responsibility. But when it comes with this flawed perception of risk, and so I wonder, in some ways, the like the last 5% of the bell curve, if you will, of this idea of protecting people from harm is underpinning some of these things, because the harm from losing, the harm from competition, it's we can't hurt people's feelings, we can't hurt each other, it's I mean, the amount of times I try to break through it every time it comes up, like self-restraint. It's like, if I can't speak my truth, then what can I speak? But I might offend someone in doing so. It's we start to just numb ourselves out into this nothingness.
Oh, it's just pathetic. And this argument, which I don't think I've ever engaged because it's very difficult to take seriously, is this level of didactic rationalism. The libertarians with their non-aggression principle, and then applying it to the coronavirus. I mean, it's unbelievable the level of confusion and actually, quite frankly, stupidity that's associated with this position. I just think that it's unbelievable. I mean, I'll just make an obvious point. You need exposure to pathogens in order to protect you from more serious ones. And far from being aggression, somebody giving you a cold, if you could possibly contract trace such thing, which you can't. If you shoot me, I definitely know who did it. But if I'm out going to the store and hanging around at the bars, and I wake up tomorrow morning with a sore throat, there's no possible way for me to be able to contract trace that. It's ridiculous. But what's remarkable about this is, getting sick and then recovering builds your immune system. Okay, so I'm embarrassed even to talk about this, because libertarians are in many ways my tribe, but they just are so flopped so miserably during this last 2 years. So what they don't get is that it's not necessarily aggression; it could be benevolence, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, old-fashioned vaccines gave you a pathogen in order to build your immune system to overcome them. That's not aggression. That's benevolence. That's beneficence. That's giving you a gift. Okay. So how do you toggle between those things? They always describe pathogenic spread as a negative externality. Well, what if it's the opposite? What if it's a positive externality? Especially in a world where everybody's going to get COVID. You want people to recover and be stronger than ever. So the libertarian position on this is so uncomplicated and idiotic that they couldn't even, again, think through cell biology. They can't even they could sit down and read 1,000-page treatises by Hayek, but they can't be bothered to read a 50-page manual on cell biology for dummies. So I'm sorry. That subject infuriates me. But so the thing is that every ideological group had its excuses for going along with the ruling class narrative at the time. And libertarians, were especially somehow good at that, implausibly so. But it's true. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did. I think it's important to recognize, because there's just so much. I think groupthink, dominant ideologies, media influences. It's just been palpable, and I know that Matthias Desmet has written about this extensively. His new book is going to talk about some of these concepts. I think these are particular problems of the digital, always-on world that we live in, whereby, we used to go to the corner shop to buy a newspaper to understand what's going on in the world. I'm just about young and old enough to remember that. Certainly growing up, my father reading the newspaper every evening, that's how he got his information. But we now have this always-on world, and we don't live in a space where information is dissected and critical points are put around. We live in accordance with the algorithms. We live in amongst cancel culture. We live in a world where critical voices are deplatformed. increasingly so. So actually our ability to discern and make sense of the world is being limited by this. And some people are describing this as a victory for democracy. I don't understand, because the aggregation principle says you need full information in order for it to work.
And in particular with the issue of pathogens and infectious disease, for some reason, for decades, we've gotten into this mindset that avoidance is always the answer, and it's not. It's not the answer. I mean, avoiding all pathogens, is going to destroy society and destroy people's health. And I worry sometimes. And I had a person ask me this question. It was very early on in the pandemic. A real champion of vaccines. He said, "Do you think there was some sort of turning point with the chickenpox vaccine?" I said, "Well, why is that?" Because, in the old days, it was always understood that, even dating way back, that exposure is the path to health. That was true even for things like polio, despite getting a very good vaccine. This is a very stable pathogen from which you can vaccine. But the chickenpox vaccine came about in, I don't know, the 1970s, 1980s. And so now you had the first generation of history that really, at least in the 20th century, that wasn't deliberately exposed to chickenpox, right? So, and you're probably not a little old enough for this, but it was very common that, and this is science-based, good public health, that you want your kid exposed to chickenpox as early as possible so that the consequences of getting it would be minimal, and that you would develop lifetime immunities to it. So when one kid in the classroom would get chickenpox, one parent would excitedly call all the other parents, and they would immediately hold a party, and that wasn't dangerous. That wasn't reckless. That was good practice of public health. And then the chickenpox vaccine came along, so that was the last time that exposure was in any sense connected with the functioning of the immune system. And so you had several generations raised to believe that shots were always and everywhere the key to health. Shots and pills, and that really did change people's, I think, attitudes, because it wasn't a tactile experience anybody really ever had to inform them about the reality of pathogenic immunity. I don't know. Maybe that's a simplistic explanation, but it is a symptom of something you're talking about. That's a much more broad thing, which is, that the way we've constructed a world to minimize exposure to any dangers, to the maximum extent. In fact, that's the whole purpose of life. Eliminate all risk, eliminate all competition, never hurt anybody's feelings. Everybody has to live in a super safe space of our own construction all the time. Well, that makes us very vulnerable to be manipulated by these by things like infectious disease panics.
Yes, Jeffrey, I've lost track of time a little bit. How are you doing for time?
Well, I'm doing fine. I would probably do another 15 minutes or so if you're up to it.
Yes, absolutely. I want to get to some point of at least inspiration and hope for the future, so that we have a kind of a discussion around where, in the face of all this, because it's like a palpable background noise. Like, it's just there all the time now. Everywhere you turn, this cultural safetyism, this authoritarianism. In the UK right now, we've got a war on free speech. We've got the online safety bill. We've got the police bill, which is threatening dissent. We've got the Human Rights Act reform, which is threatening our human rights in the UK, long-held human rights. And it's politicians are becoming more authoritarian. The democracy index is at its lowest point since its inception. Amongst all of this, we've got an economic crisis mounting, which is going to unlikely, I would have thought, lead to some sort of mass civil unrest if it hasn't already. It feels pretty bleak. So I'd like to at least spend a portion of time talking to some degree about solutions. And I know that some of the work you're doing at Brownstone right now is kind of a post-mortem of what's gone on in order to extract some of those lessons. I think that's a very important component. You know, the UK is going through a public inquiry process at the minute, but I hold up zero hope for this political process.
Yeah, so those have all been stopped in the US. So it's interesting it's still going on in the UK. And I think, yeah, you're right, there is one in the UK. And it's fairly broad-based, right? I mean, it includes thinkers from a variety of different perspectives, but I don't know how you reconcile zero COVID with the views of somebody like Senator Gupta. I don't know what that report looks like in the end. I mean, it's probably just going to be completely incoherent. But in the U.S., there's no commissions at all. A year ago, they were the lockdowns were all priding themselves in their glorious achievement. So they got funding, millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars from this foundation, that foundation to hold a big commission. But then, as cases rose and public anger grew, and it became obvious that they destroyed a whole generation of kids and their education, and businesses were failing all over the place, and mental health crisis and everything else. So they disbanded the commissions of the U.S. So unless something happens, we will not. To have good postmortems, and so that's a lot of what Brownstone's doing right now. Is we're working, I would say, fairly behind the scenes to put together a template for commissions, and these commissions should be everywhere. They should be in every city, every state, every nation in the world. We've got to figure out who did what to whom, what they knew, what they expected, what in fact happened, what the science was actually saying, not what the ruling class experts claimed the science was saying, but was actually saying at the time. So we need the truth more than anything else. I mean, we need to know what happened, and not just pretend like it didn't happen. And then we need to know the truth about what happened. So that's the first step. If we can get that part done, I think that's the essential step towards recovery and reconstruction. And then, of course, the really hard part starts, which is dealing with fundamental philosophical issues concerning human liberty and human rights and issues of equality. And I think that's going to take a generation. These things don't happen overnight, as Thomas Kuhn says in his book Structure of Scientific Revolution. Sometimes the failed orthodoxy can persist, as long as all the practitioners of it are still living and breathing among us. So sometimes it takes a full change, of a full generation. Like everybody has to retire and be gone before you get new people. But the question is, what are the new people going to believe? And I think that's the real challenge we face. And as you say, the problem is we're doing this in the midst of a growing crisis. The economic crisis alone is, as you suggest, likely going to be terrible and cause a doubling down on the very problem that we're trying to get rid of. I mean, I'll just give you an example. It's pretty interesting because it plays into the themes you're talking about here. The attempt to eliminate all risk and all downside to life and all sadness and all natural forces work in the world. I mean, what happens if, in the attempt to suppress the inflation, our lords and masters, prompt a depression, a declining productivity and technical depression, alongside an inflation. What's going to be the response to that? Now, in an ideal world, what you would have is fiscal and monetary elites would say, well, there was a bubble. We went too far with all the spending and the money creation and all this stuff, and everything you see in the world right now is an inevitable consequence of that. So let's turn off the money printers, turn off the spending spigots, let the correction happen, and give it a couple of years, and then we'll be back on the road to recovery. Okay, that will never happen. I'm sorry to say that there is nothing alive in UK or US politics or European politics anywhere in the world that's going to let that happen. We have a kind of an ethos that I mean, for 40 years, it's been 40 years since we've tolerated that sort of thing. Let the downturn take place so that we can build a good basis for prosperity in the future. That will not happen. So you're going to get more spending, more money printing, more of the same nonsense that's harmed us so badly right now. So this attempt at philosophical rethinking of the basis of civil society is going to occur within the framework of an economic calamity, not to mention a deep political crisis for the ruling class of all parties in all countries. So well, if you want to live in exciting times, these are the exciting times for sure. I don't mind it so much because I think what's happened to us is Schumpeter wrote this in his book that he wrote, I think, during World War II. I think it might have been 42 or something. Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy. He said the problem is that prosperity contains the seeds of its own destruction, because the more prosperous people get, and however many, as the generations go on and on and on, they forget the source of the good life. They're enjoying the good life, but they forget what gives rise to it, and they begin to eat it and destroy those institutions that gave rise to it because they're out of sheer ignorance. And maybe that's true. And Hayek said the same thing in his 1946 article on the intellectual origins of socialism. He ends it by saying, no people love liberty as much as those who have lost it in that generation. And he says, I hope we don't have to get to that point in the West before we make liberty an exciting intellectual and life project again. Well, we have lost those liberties as much as you could ever, I hope, describe that. That has happened to us. So I hope that, in Hayek's sense, this prompts a kind of rethinking of the relationship between the individual and the state, between our community functioning and ruling class mastery over society. We need a kind of a philosophical revolution, a complete rethinking, similar to what happened in, what was the 13th century with the Magna Carta, or the 18th century rise of the Scottish Enlightenment, and so on. We desperately need that, or what almost happened after World War I but didn't, for a variety of reasons. We need that in the 21st century, just a dramatic rethinking of everything. And anybody who tells you that we don't need that is not facing the truth. The crisis is real and massive and global, and so too is the need for a complete cultural and intellectual revolution. If we continue down this path, the disasters in the last 2 years are going to look like nothing compared to what we're going to face in the future. But we still do have a chance to turn around. The problem for people like you and me is that we don't have the ability to do this on our own. We make our best shot at it. I think we're doing good work. That's why I started Brownstone, and I'm thrilled at our 50 million readers, and I think it is making a difference. Everything we publish into the comments so that it gets maximum exposure and maximum reprints, and that's all good. But it's going to take many, many individuals like yourself and many institutions like Brownstone in order to achieve this. And I don't know what other path there is. There's a role for everybody in this, even political activists, intellectuals, political activists, writers, journalists, common, regular people who are bringing the lawsuits, who are writing the letters to the editor and speaking out to their friends and neighbors. Everybody has a role when civilization is sweeping to destruction. There's a role for everybody to enter into this intellectual battle in order to save what it is we love.
Incredible. Yeah, Jeffrey, I'm seeing the seeds of this happening everywhere. Organizations like Brownstone emerging, Elevate, our organization. There's individual thinkers, writers, organizations emerging. We're kind of loosely connected, but not necessarily interconnected. I think at this stage, there's lots of people in disparate communities doing work on this type of thing. I do see, people have started to describe it as, I don't like the simplicity of just putting the term neo in front of anything to make it sound new, but the neo-enlightenment phase where we're entering into a new epoch of thinking. But some of those historical moments where, significant treaties or new ways of living have come to being. I at this stage, whilst there's certainly a lot of intellectual philosophizing about what's happening right now, the mechanics of translating that thinking and a new philosophy for the world that we're living in right now to actually shifting our culture, I don't even know where to begin in terms of actually proliferating that, other than the fact that these communities are, the fact that you're reaching 50 million people, we've reached, a humble 10 to 15 million, but we're clearly engaging people in the conversation. I think there's an element of reach, but what's your take in terms of actually going from that kind of making sense of what's going on in the world, kind of the kind of looking back, but also looking forward? How do you see it actually playing out? I agree with you. I think it's a generational piece of work, but actually, how does it culminate? Do you think? What will create the ultimate shifts?
At the end of the religious wars in Europe, it's fascinating how they kind of what prompted the Treaty of Westphalia and the eventual emergence of this idea of religious liberty. It really was a kind of social and civilizational exhaustion. The costs of winning are just too high. The blood that's shed, the trauma, the sheer destruction that emerges from the Schmittian world of friends and enemies is not making life better. It's making it much worse. And that became clear. And this great experiment and just letting people sort of believe what they wanted seemed to have more or less worked out. And then it became codified and treatises, in favor of religious liberty. And then that gradually unfolded over the centuries. And that's a very Victorian style tale, but I think it's more or less correct. So this point of exhaustion, are we there yet? I'd like to think so. I'm not sure. We may have a while yet to go, but that's usually what happens, is that people just get tired of the fight. It just like, is there a better way to live? Maybe just getting along with other people and recognizing the equal dignity of everybody and letting people just kind of, letting this society function and the market function on its own without the Bill Gateses and Anthony Fauci's and Jeremy Farrars telling us how to live. I hope we get to that point. We have gotten to that point in the past where we said, well, to heck with, we let the kings and the popes and the bishops and lords tell us what to do, and it didn't really work. So why don't we have a different system? And I hope that we arrive at that same conviction with regard to the scientific media ruling classes of our own time, and to say they have not made a better world for us. They made everything even worse. So we don't exactly know for sure what liberty and equality look like, but why don't we give it a shot? Something's got to be better than this endless war. I hope.
I think my personal feelings were just at the beginning. I feel like, I'm no author. I'm a reasonable writer, but I feel like the Orwell, Huxley, and me wants to write a story about where I see this heading before it gets better. There's some trajectories and trends along the lines that we've witnessed the last couple of years that in some way I feel like have to play out in order to get to a point where people finally say enough's enough. I don't know if the economic crisis will push people that far, but I think certainly there's going to be some of this, we know best technocratic, technological advancements that will push this storyline even further into the future. And what we'll have to endure neo-enlightenment, I think but at least the seeds of the change are sweeping. But anything's possible. I remain ambitious and optimistic that we can affect change.
Long term. And in any case, the one way to guarantee failure is to do nothing. So
absolutely.
We can't guarantee success, but we can guarantee failure. And not holding this podcast, not writing articles, not dedicating ourselves to this neo enlightenment, to a new renaissance, I guess you could say, is a very destructive path. In the end, history is built by the ideas we hold, and nothing else. There's no meta gods dictating some trajectory of history, some winds of change that sweep over us. No, I mean we build our own lives based on our beliefs. That's why they want to censor us. It's Censorship is the tribute that the ruling class gives to the power of ideas, which are always more powerful than armies, or guns, or money, or resources. The things you believe about yourself and about your neighbors and your friends and the kind of society you want to live in, that ultimately become the building blocks for what the future looks like. So we should never underestimate that. The power of speaking, the power of writing, and the power of influence. It's sometimes just a pebble on a pond, but the waves can extend for miles.
Thank you, Jeffrey. This has been a thoroughly insightful conversation, and we managed to inject a little hope there at the end through the seeds of change that is beginning to create. And I absolutely thoroughly agree with you. It's that ripple effect that becomes a wave. I speak about that really frequently on this show, and it's those that are willing to get out there and create those initial drops that will be the ones that create the splash that create something that will eventually become a wave of change. So I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. For our audience, I invite you to check out Brownstone Institute if you haven't already done so. You can go to brownstone.org. It's been one of my go-to sources over the course of the last month, certainly since Brownstone became a thing back in May last year, alongside the likes of Collateral Global. There's some really great organizations out there that are examining with a critical lens what's happened over the last couple of years, but also taking a broader view of what this means for society and how we can continue to live in a free and open world, free and open societies, which is increasingly, well, the dominant conversation of the day for us here on the Elevate podcast. So thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks to our audience who've watched this episode. Please do hit the share button. The more people that we can engage in conversations like this, the faster that ripple can become a wave. So I do encourage you to hit the share. And if you haven't already subscribed to the show, I invite you to go to danastingregory.com/podcast and join our mailing list so you can keep up to date with our latest conversations like this. And finally, you can also check out the show in audio format on Spotify, Apple, and all major podcast platforms if you prefer to listen to the audio. So thank you once again to Jeffrey, and thank you to our audience here at Elevate. I look forward to seeing you on our very next conversation.